The first time Theresa Bell walked into the general store in Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1878, every man in the place went quiet, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the way she carried herself, like a woman who had already survived the worst the world could throw at her, and had decided the world could go straight to the devil if it tried again. She was 26 years old, brown-haired and sun-touched, with eyes the color of creek water after a long rain, somewhere between gray and green, depending on the light. She wore a plain calico dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to a soft, honest gray, and on the third finger of her left hand, she wore a gold band that caught the afternoon light coming through the store's single dusty window like a small, quiet warning. That ring was not a secret. Theresa Bell had no secrets she cared to keep. Her husband, Jonas Bell, had died 14 months ago of a fever that swept through the mining camps east of Reno, the way fire swept through dry grass fast, merciless, and without any particular regard for who deserved to live and who did not. Jonas had been a good man. Not a remarkable man, but a decent one, and Theresa had loved him in the steady, practical way that you love something you have built a life around. She had grieved him honestly, cried at night when the loneliness pressed down too hard, and then gotten up every morning and done what needed to be done, because there was no one else to do it. What needed doing was running the small boarding house she had inherited along with Jonas's debts. 3 rooms above a feed store on the main road through Dusty Creek, a town that had sprung up near a silver vein that was already starting to show signs of giving out. The men who stayed in her rooms were mostly miners and drifters, and within 3 weeks of Jonas's passing, she had learned something unpleasant and true about the world. A widow without a man at her side was considered available by a certain kind of man, whether she wanted to be or not. The ring kept most of them in line. Not all of them, but most. There was something about a gold band that made even the most determined drifter hesitate, some residual sense of propriety that the frontier had not quite burned away. She wore Jonas's ring every single day, and she wore it deliberately, turning it on her finger sometimes when a conversation got uncomfortable, a small, subtle reminder. It was, she had come to understand, the most useful thing Jonas had left her. She had not expected to stop wearing it. She had not planned to stop. But then, she had not planned on Levi Redmond either. Levi Redmond arrived in Dusty Creek on a Tuesday in the middle of April, 1878, on a roan horse that looked like it had been ridden hard and not apologized to. He was 31 years old, lean and quiet in the way of a man who had learned that speaking when you had nothing to say was a waste of breath and everyone's time. He had dark brown hair that curled a little at the ears when the weather was damp, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red stone that made up the hills outside of town. He had brown eyes that were steady and warm and paid attention to things in a way that most people's eyes did not. He came to Theresa's boarding house on the recommendation of the livery stable owner, a round man named Percy, who told everyone new in town where to find a clean bed and a decent meal. Theresa was sweeping the front step when Levi rode up, and she looked at him the way she looked at all new arrivals, measuring, careful, a little distant. "Looking for a room," he said, pulling his horse to a stop and touching the brim of his hat. "Percy sent me." "Percy sends everyone," Theresa said, not unkindly. "It's $2 a week, breakfast included. No drinking in the rooms, no fighting, no guests after 9. You break something, you replace it." Levi considered this. "Sounds fair." "It is fair," she said simply, and went back inside to get the key. He took the room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faced the mountains. He was quiet from the start, quieter than most of the men who passed through, who tended to be loud in the way of men with nowhere settled to put their energy. Levi came down to breakfast each morning, said good morning, ate what was put in front of him without complaint, and went about his business. His business, she gathered from Percy and from the usual channels of small-town information, was that he was a surveyor working for a land company out of Carson City, mapping water rights and property boundaries in the region. He had supper at the boarding house most evenings too, because Theresa offered it for an extra 50 cents, and the only other option in Dusty Creek was the saloon, which served food that was technically food in the same way that a mud hole was technically a water source. The other boarders at the time were two older miners named Clyde and Horatio, who had been sharing the second room for 3 years, and had developed the particular domestic ease of two men who had long since run out of things to argue about, and a young telegraph operator named Martin who was 20 years old and homesick for Ohio, and talked about it constantly. None of them bothered Theresa in the way that other men sometimes had. She had been fortunate in her current boarders, though she knew from experience that fortune in this regard was temporary. The trouble started in the second week of April, before Levi arrived, in the form of a man named Dale Cotter. Dale Cotter was not the worst kind of man, which made him more frustrating in some ways than the genuinely bad ones, because you could not simply write him off. He was a rancher, well established in the valley, with land and cattle and a decent reputation for most things except the particular thing that was becoming a problem. His wife had died the previous winter, and he had decided, with the kind of blunt, uncomplicated certainty that characterized all his decisions, that Theresa Bell would make a suitable replacement. He had begun stopping by the boarding house on various pretexts, a question about whether she had a room available, though she always had a sign out when she did not, a jar of preserves his housekeeper had sent, a request to use her back porch to look at some paperwork, which made no earthly sense. Each time, he would find a way to let her know that he was a man of property, and that a woman in her situation ought to be thinking practically about her future. Theresa was always polite, because politeness cost her nothing, and antagonizing a man with Dale Cotter standing in Dusty Creek could cost her considerably more than nothing. But she was always clear, and her clarity included the deliberate placement of her left hand somewhere visible, the gold ring catching whatever light was available. Dale Cotter was not, unfortunately, a man who read signals with any great skill. It was on a Wednesday evening in late April, 3 days after Levi Redmond had taken his room, that Dale Cotter arrived at the boarding house at supper time, uninvited and apparently expecting to be fed. Theresa was in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the front room, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She was not afraid of Dale Cotter, and everything to do with the exhaustion of a situation that would not resolve itself. She came out of the kitchen with her apron still on and found Dale standing in the front room, hat in hand, talking at Martin the telegraph operator, who had the look of a young man who very much wished he were in Ohio. "Mr. Cotter," Theresa said, "supper's not a public meal, I'm sure you understand. Now, Mrs. Bell," Dale said, turning to her with the particular smile of a man who had decided that no was a position that could be negotiated around. "I was just passing by and thought I'd say hello. No harm in that, is there?" "No harm," she agreed, in a tone that indicated she was not entirely certain about this. "But we're sitting down to eat shortly, so if you've said hello, you're welcome to be on your way." That was when Levi Redmond came down the stairs. He had clearly been washing up. His hair was still damp, and he had a clean shirt on that was unbuttoned at the collar. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the room with those steady brown eyes, taking in Dale Cotter, taking in Theresa's expression, taking in the whole particular texture of the moment with the attention of a man who was good at reading landscapes. He did not say anything dramatic. He simply came down the last 2 stairs and said, "Evening. Smells good from upstairs, Mrs. Bell. You need anything before we sit down?" It was a small thing. It was nothing, really. Just a man coming downstairs to supper. But the way he said it, the casual, easy way he included himself in the domestic arrangement of the evening, the way he stood at the bottom of the stairs with the particular ease of someone who belonged there, shifted the temperature of the room in a way that was subtle and definitive. Dale Cotter looked at Levi. Levi looked back at Dale Cotter with an expression of mild, polite inquiry. "Didn't realize you had company," Dale said to Theresa, with an edge to it that he clearly could not help. "I have boarders," Theresa said. "Mr. Redmond is one of them. Excuse me, I need to get back to the kitchen." She went back through the door, and through the wall she heard Dale Cotter take his leave, and then she heard the front door close, and then she stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the worktop and breathed. When she came out to set supper on the table, Levi was already seated with Clyde and Horatio and Martin, and he did not make anything of what had happened. He did not offer to be her protector or suggest she needed one. He simply passed the bread when it was needed and asked Clyde something about the silver seam he was working, and the evening went on in its ordinary way. Theresa appreciated this more than she could easily have said. She was not a woman who wanted to be rescued. She had been managing her own affairs for 14 months and had managed them adequately. What she resented, more than the Dale Cotters of the world, was the assumption that she could not. But there was something different about the way Levi Redmond had come down those stairs, not as a rescuer, not as a man staking a claim, but as something quieter and more decent. Just a man who had seen something slightly wrong and inserted himself into it sideways, without fanfare, and then moved on. She thought about it while she washed the dishes, and then she put it away and went to bed. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Theresa had not quite anticipated. Levi's survey work took him out into the hills most days, and he would come back in the early evening, dusty and tired, and wash up and come down to supper. He was not a man who talked much without cause, but he was not unfriendly. When conversation happened, he participated in it genuinely, and there was a quality to his listening that made you feel that what you said was actually being heard rather than simply waited out. Martin, the telegraph operator, who was lonely and young and grateful for any attentive ear, had latched onto him almost immediately, and Levi endured this with a patience that Theresa privately thought was either saintly or very well practiced. She found herself talking to him more than she had talked to any of her boarders, though it was a gradual thing, the way temperature changes. You do not notice each degree, only the difference between where you started and where you are. It began with practical matters. He asked her one morning over breakfast whether she had any trouble with the roof on the east side, because he had noticed what looked like water damage on the ceiling of his room. She had been meaning to deal with it for a month and had not had the money or the time, and she told him so honestly. He said he had some experience with roofing from his years before the surveying work, and if she could get the materials, he would take a look at it on Sunday when he did not work. She almost refused, out of the habit she had developed of not accepting help from men, because help from men tended to come with assumptions attached. But she looked at his face when he offered matter of fact, no particular weight to it, the same way he might have offered to open a door and accepted. He fixed the roof on Sunday. She made lemonade and brought it up to him while he worked, and they had a brief, sensible conversation about the angle of the pitch and the likelihood of another hard winter, and it was one of the most comfortable conversations she had had in a long time because it was about nothing except the roof and the weather and was therefore completely without subtext. It opened something, though. After the roof, they talked more. Not long conversations. Neither of them was inclined to long conversations without purpose, but real ones, with actual content. She told him about the boarding house and the debts Jonas had left, and the particular economics of keeping it running on the edge of a mining town that might be declining. He told her about the survey work, which sounded from the outside like a lonely occupation, but which he seemed to genuinely enjoy the precision of it. The way you could establish exactly where one thing ended and another began. The satisfaction of making something uncertain into something known. She asked him once, without quite planning to, what had brought him to Dusty Creek specifically, and he was quiet for a moment in a way that felt less like evasion and more like honest consideration. "The work brought me," he said. I go where the contracts are." He paused. "I was in Colorado before this, before that Wyoming. I've been moving around for about 8 years." "You don't have somewhere you'd rather be?" she asked. He looked out the kitchen window at the brown hills. "I used to think I'd settle eventually, find a place that suited. I just haven't found it yet." He did not ask her the corresponding question, which she appreciated because the answer was complicated. She was where she was because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to be, and she was making peace with that. But it was a peace that had more effort in it than she liked to admit. The ring on her finger was so much a part of her daily existence by that point that she mostly did not think about it. She wore it. Men saw it. Most of them behaved accordingly. Dale Cotter had come back twice more in May, but his visits had a more tentative quality now. He had heard, as everyone in Dusty Creek eventually heard everything, that she had a full house of boarders and was managing well, and Theresa dealt with him with the same polite, firm efficiency she brought to everything. She was in the general store on a Thursday afternoon in early June when she overheard something that bothered her more than she admitted to herself at the time. She was behind a shelf of dry goods, and 2 women were talking near the front. Adelaide Morrison, who was married to the bank manager and therefore considered herself the social compass of Dusty Creek, and her friend Dora Finch, who was the compass's needle. "She's keeping that ring on," Adelaide was saying, in a tone that was not quite disapproving and not quite sympathetic, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "Jonah's Bell has been gone over a year. It starts to seem like a performance at some point." "Maybe she means it," Dora said, with somewhat more generosity. "Maybe. Or maybe she's using it to keep any eligible man at arm's length because she doesn't want to have to be a wife again. And you can't exactly blame her, given the debts Jonah's left, but there's a surveyor staying in her rooms that half the women in this town have noticed is a decent-looking man with steady employment, and she treats him like he's furniture." Theresa did not make herself known. She waited until the women had moved on, then bought her flour and her salt and walked home with her spine very straight and her jaw set in a way that meant she was working hard at not feeling something. She sat with the conversation that night long after the house had gone quiet. The accusation performance had lodged somewhere under her sternum like a splinter. She turned it over, examined it. Was she performing? She did not think so. She had loved Jonah's imperfectly and practically and truly. She wore his ring because she was his widow and because it was useful and because taking it off felt like closing a door she was not sure she was ready to close. But sitting there in the dark of her kitchen with a single lamp and the sound of the Nevada wind against the windows, she wondered for the first time whether she was keeping the door closed not out of grief, but out of fear. Fear of the vulnerability of it. Fear of building something again and losing it again. Jonah's death had not been violent or dramatic. He had simply gotten sick and then gotten sicker and then been gone, and the world had gone right on without him as if he had never been very important to begin with, and something about that ordinariness had been harder than Theresa expected. She did not arrive at any conclusions that night. She simply went to bed. June moved into July, and the summer heat descended on Dusty Creek with the particular ferocity of the Nevada desert, the kind that made the air shimmer above the road, and the dogs lie flat in whatever shade they could find, and every conversation slowed down by about a third. The silver mine to the east announced that it was reducing its workforce, which everyone in town had been expecting and no one wanted to hear, and there was a general, low-level anxious hum to the place that put everyone's nerves a little closer to the surface. Clyde and Horatio, the 2 veteran miners, were not directly affected because they worked a smaller, independent claim, but the news worried them. Martin, the telegraph operator, sent more messages per day as the layoffs generated correspondence, and received a letter from his mother in Ohio that made him cry quietly in his room at night, though he thought no one could hear him. Theresa heard him, and she left a plate of biscuits outside his door the next morning without comment, which was the most comforting thing she could think of to do. It was in that July that she noticed Levi Redmond looking at her differently. Not in the way Dale Cotter looked at her, which was the look of a man appraising livestock with a view to purchase. This was something quieter and more careful, the way you look at something you have been thinking about, not the way you look at something you want to own. She caught it twice, once over supper when she had said something that made the table laugh, and once in the morning when she had not heard him come into the kitchen and she had been standing at the stove with her hair still loose, singing softly to herself, and she turned to find him in the doorway and he was looking at her with an expression that he replaced quickly with his usual one, but not quite quickly enough. She did not say anything. She did not know what she would say. The feeling that moved through her when she caught that look was not simple or easily categorized. It was warmer than she wanted it to be and more unsettling, and it stayed with her in a way that inconvenienced her considerably. She was in the habit, on Sunday afternoons when the house was quiet, of sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee and whatever mending needed doing, and it was on one of these Sundays that Levi found his way to the back porch too, with a book and the remnants of his own coffee, and asked in that matter-of-fact way of his whether she minded. She said she did not mind. They sat together for perhaps an hour, her mending and him reading, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that silences between people are only comfortable when something real has been established, when you have moved past the stage of needing to fill the air with words to prevent it from getting heavy. It was Levi who broke the silence first, and he did it by asking the question that everyone else in Dusty Creek had apparently considered their business, and yet no one had ever thought to actually ask her directly. He set down his book and looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and he said, quietly and without any particular preamble, "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked up from the mending. "You can ask." He was quiet for a moment as if measuring his words carefully, and then he said, "The ring. Was he a good man?" And that was all. Not how long has he been gone, not are you planning to remarry, not some version of I think you should be moving on by now. Just, was he a good man? Theresa looked at the ring for a long moment, the gold band that had been on her finger for 3 years, the 2 of their marriage and the 14 months since, and felt something shift inside her chest that was not painful exactly, but was not comfortable either. It was the particular feeling of something that has been held in one position for a very long time beginning tentatively to move. He was a decent man, she said. He wasn't perfect. He made some poor decisions with money. He was not always as present as I would have liked, but he was kind and he tried to do right by me, and he did not deserve to die of a fever at 31 years old. Levi nodded, listening in that careful way of his. "I wear it," she continued, and she had not planned to say this, had not known she would say it until the words were coming out, partly because it was his and I haven't known what to do with that, and partly because it keeps men at a certain distance that I have found useful. Levi did not look offended by this frankness or surprised by it. He simply looked at her with the attentiveness he brought to all things worth attending to. "Does it work?" he asked. "Mostly," she said. "Not always." He was quiet again. Then he said, "You don't have to wear it on my account. I want you to know that." It was not a declaration. It was not a request. It was simply an offer of honesty, placed quietly in the space between them, and what she did with it was entirely her own business. She looked at the ring for a long moment, and then she looked at Levi Redmond, and she thought about what Adelaide Morrison had said performance, and she thought about Jonas, who had been a decent man who deserved to be remembered, and she thought about the fact that a ring on her finger was not the same thing as grief in her heart, and one could end without the other necessarily ending too. She took the ring off. She did it without ceremony or drama. She slid it off her finger and held it in her palm for a moment, the small gold circle that had served as armor for longer than it had served as a wedding band. And then she closed her fingers around it carefully and set it in her pocket. Her hand felt strange without it, light and exposed and unfamiliar, like a hand belonging to a different version of herself. Levi did not say anything. He did not celebrate or make much of it. He simply looked at her with those eyes that paid attention to things, and there was something in his expression that was warm and careful and glad in a quiet way that did not demand anything from her. She picked up her mending again. He picked up his book. They sat on the back porch for another hour in that comfortable silence, and when the sun got low and it was time to start supper, she went inside and he followed. And nothing had changed and everything had changed, and Theresa Bell thought, very quietly and carefully and without speaking it to anyone, that she was beginning to be in serious trouble. She put Jonas's ring in the small cedar box on her dresser where she kept the things that mattered, alongside his watch and the 2 photographs they had taken in Reno. She could take it out and look at it whenever she wanted. She could remember him whenever she wanted. The ring in a box and the ring on her finger were different things, and the difference mattered. What followed was not a swift courtship. Both of them were too careful for that, too accustomed to managing on their own, too honest about the complications of any kind of attachment in a place and time where everything could change without warning. But things developed between them with the same quality that she had noticed in their silences, a real, unhurried quality, something that was building itself on actual ground rather than on the excitement of the new. They walked together on Sunday evenings, through the edge of town and up along the creek that gave the place its name. It was not much of a creek in July, more of a suggestion of water, but it had cottonwood trees along its banks that gave shade and a sense of coolness that was largely illusory but deeply appreciated. These walks were easy and real. They talked about what was happening in the town and what they were each thinking about, and sometimes they were quiet, and both kinds of time felt equally good. He told her more about himself in pieces, the way that careful people reveal themselves. He had grown up in Missouri, the younger of 2 sons on a farm that had struggled through the years after the war. His father had been decent but tired, and his mother had been the real engine of the household, a woman who had kept the family together through several seasons that should have broken them, and had never seemed to think this was remarkable. Levi had left at 22, not because there was anything wrong with home, but because the frontier was opening and he was young, and he had the particular restlessness of young men who cannot yet name what they are looking for. He had learned surveying from an older man in Kansas, a taciturn German named Heinrich, who had taken him on as an assistant and taught him the work with the patience of someone who genuinely loved precision. Levi had taken to it immediately, the exactness of it, the way it imposed order on wild land, the way it turned the theoretical into the actual. He had been doing it for 8 years, moving west as the work moved west, and he had been good at it and mostly content, but content was not the same as satisfied, and he was honest enough with himself to know the difference. He had not spoken of any particular woman before Theresa, and she did not ask, because she had no right to, and because it was not her business until he made it her business, and she trusted him to do that when and if it was appropriate. She found herself thinking about him during the day when he was out in the hills with his instruments. Not obsessively, she had too much to do for that, and the boarding house demanded constant attention, especially since Martin the telegraph operator had given notice in August that he was going back to Ohio, which meant she needed a new boarder, which meant the particular work of assessing strangers. But she thought about him in the small, recurring way that someone occupies your mind when they have become important to you, the way you notice their absence from a room you are in. Martin left on a Tuesday in late August with his trunk, and his homesickness and Theresa's genuine good wishes. She stood on the porch and waved him off and felt the particular small grief of someone who had been part of your life for a year, and was now going to be only a memory and possibly a letter occasionally. The new boarder was a woman, which was unusual enough that it created considerable comment in Dusty Creek. Her name was Rosa Garza, and she was 34 years old, a Mexican-American woman from New Mexico, who had come to Nevada as the seamstress for a traveling theatrical company that had then dissolved, leaving her stranded in Dusty Creek with her skills and her sewing box and a pragmatic determination that Theresa recognized and respected immediately. Rosa was dark-haired and handsome and sharp-eyed, and had a sense of humor that was dry and precise and functioned, Theresa suspected, as armor in the way that Theresa's ring had functioned as armor. The two women took to each other with the efficient warmth of people who have been waiting for someone to understand them without explanation. Rosa was good for Theresa in ways that became apparent quickly. She was observant in the way of an outsider who has learned to read rooms carefully, and she noticed things about the dynamic of the boarding house supper table that she did not hesitate to remark on privately to Theresa, with a combination of accuracy and amusement that was extremely inconvenient. "That man watches you like you're something worth studying," Rosa said one evening in September, when Theresa was in the kitchen and Rosa had come in to help with the washing up in the way she sometimes did because she disliked being idle. Not in a bad way, in the way of someone trying to understand something they care about. "He's observant," Theresa said, scrubbing a pot. "It's part of his work. He is not surveying you for a land company," Rosa said, and her tone was entirely kind and not at all willing to be argued with. Theresa did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Rosa looked at her. So I don't know what to do about it," Theresa said, which was the most honest thing she had said about it to anyone, including herself. Rosa dried a plate with thoughtful efficiency. "You could start by letting him know that you know." "I am not entirely sure that is wise." "Wise," Rosa said with gentle patience, "is a good goal for business decisions. For matters of the heart, I think something a little less wise and a little more brave is what is actually called for." Theresa thought about this for several days. It was in early October that things shifted again, in the particular way of things that have been accumulating quietly until they have enough weight to move. The occasion was, of all things, a social evening at the Morrison house. Adelaide Morrison organized these periodic gatherings as a way of maintaining her social position and her sense of what was happening in Dusty Creek, and attendance was not precisely mandatory, but was strongly encouraged by the social pressures that operated in small towns the way weather operated in open country. You could resist them, but you got wet. Theresa went every time, because she was a businesswoman in this town and needed to stay on reasonable terms with the people in it. She went with Rosa, who had been invited somewhat reluctantly by Adelaide, who had conflicting views on the subject of Rosa, but could not find a specific objection that would hold up under examination. Levi had been invited too. Adelaide had an eye for eligible men and a talent for strategic hospitality. The gathering was at the Morrison house, which was the grandest house in Dusty Creek, a distinction that was not as grand as it sounds given what Dusty Creek was, but Adelaide had done considerable work to make it comfortable, and she took pride in it honestly. There was music. A fiddle player named Beaumont who played with the particular loose-limbed enthusiasm of a man for whom music was primarily physical, and dancing on the swept floor of the main room, and lemonade, and some of the men had whiskey that appeared from somewhere in the general vicinity of the back porch. Theresa danced with two men she did not particularly want to dance with, because to refuse would have been impolite in ways that had professional consequences, and she handled it with the practiced, pleasant efficiency of a woman who has learned to manage social situations. She did not expect Levi to ask her to dance. She had not been sure he danced, because he seemed like the kind of man who might not, and she had not asked. But late in the evening, when Beaumont switched to something slower, and several couples were swaying on the floor with the easy domesticity of people who had been doing this for years, Levi appeared at her elbow with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it. "Will you dance with me?" he said. Quietly, the way he said most things. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said yes. Dancing with Levi Redmond was nothing like dancing with the men she had danced with earlier. Those had been performances, fulfillments of social obligation, the proper steps at the proper distance. This was something different. His hand at her waist was careful and real, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had learned something and learned it well, and she found that she fit against him in a way that felt natural rather than constructed, the way you fit into a space that was made with you in mind. They did not talk much during the dance. There was not much to say that needed saying out loud. She was aware of his hand and his shoulder and the warmth of him, and she was aware that she was not wearing a ring on her left hand, and that the absence of it was not a grief but something else entirely, something she was still in the process of naming. When the music stopped, they stepped apart in the decent way, and Levi looked at her with those brown eyes and said very quietly, "Thank you." It was just 2 words, but the way he said them made it clear that he was not only thanking her for the dance, and she heard everything underneath them, and she felt her heart do something complicated and not unpleasant in her chest. She said, "You're welcome," and meant it the same way. They walked home in the October night, she and Rosa and Levi, through the cool dark of a Nevada night with the stars very large and very bright above the desert in the way that stars are over open country, as if the sky were showing off. Rosa walked ahead of them with the easy discretion of a woman who knew when to be slightly elsewhere, and Theresa and Levi walked behind in a comfortable nearness that was not quite touching but was very close. "Do you like it here?" Theresa asked him, not meaning the party specifically. He was quiet in the considering way. "More than I expected to," he said. She nodded. "The town is struggling with the mine cutting back." "I know." He paused. "My contract is up at the end of November." She had known this was coming. She had known it since the beginning when he had explained the nature of his work, the contracts, the movement, the next place. She had known it and had put it away somewhere she did not look very often, the same place she put other things that she could not change and did not want to think about. "I see," she said, in a tone that she worked to keep neutral. "The company has work in California," he said. "Sacramento area, land near the foothills." "That's good work," she said. "California is growing." He looked at her. "I haven't decided yet whether I'm going." She looked at him. In the starlight, his face was very clear and very serious, and she could see that he meant this exactly as he had said it, that there was a question being offered inside the statement gently without pressure, and that the question was hers to answer or not as she chose. She thought about what Rosa had said, wise for business, brave for matters of the heart. What would make the difference, she asked. Her voice was steady. He stopped walking, and she stopped too, and they stood in the middle of the dark road with the stars overhead and the lights of Dusty Creek behind them, and he looked at her in the way that people look at each other when they are about to say something real. "I think you know what would make the difference," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Her heart was not behaving particularly well, but she was experienced at managing in difficult conditions. "I'm not a simple situation," she said. "I have a boarding house and debts in this town and everything that goes with all of that. I'm not free the way you are free." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet again, and then he said, very simply, "I'm asking if there's a reason for me to stay in Dusty Creek." She looked at him for a long, honest moment. This man who had come down the stairs at the right moment and then never made a thing of it. This man who had fixed her roof on a Sunday and asked about her husband with the kind of question that no one else had thought to ask. This man who listened as if things were worth listening to and was quiet as if silence was worth respecting, and had looked at her once with an expression that she had been carrying around in some part of herself ever since. "Yes," she said, "there is a reason." He exhaled slowly, and in that exhaled breath she could hear what the question had cost him to ask, the effort of it, the hope underneath. His hand found hers in the dark, carefully, the way you reach for something you do not want to startle. Her left hand, the one without the ring. She felt his fingers close around hers, and she thought of Jonah's, and she thought of the cedar box on her dresser, and she thought, this is not a betrayal. This is just the next thing. She held his hand and they walked the rest of the way home. He did not leave at the end of November. He sent word to the land company in Carson City that he was extending his work in the Dusty Creek area, which was partially true. There was still survey work to be done in the surrounding country, and partially a decision that was not about work at all. He found a small office on the main street where he could work on his maps and reports, and he continued to take his meals at the boarding house. But things were different now, altered in the subtle and fundamental way of things that have been named. They were careful with each other in the way of two people who had both been hurt by carelessness in the past, not careless cruelty, but the ordinary, accidental carelessness of people and circumstances, and a world that did not consult you before it made its decisions. They moved slowly, which suited both of them. There was no rushing, no dramatic declarations, no impatience with the pace. Just a gradual, real deepening of something that had been growing quietly for months. They had supper together and walked together and talked together with an ease that Rosa observed with quiet satisfaction from her usual post of being nearby and appearing to be doing something else entirely. Clyde and Horatio, who were perceptive in the unhurried way of men who had been watching the world for a long time, also noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of gift. Dale Cotter came by the boarding house one more time in November, and Theresa dealt with him on the front step with a directness that she could afford now in a way she had perhaps not quite been able to afford before, when the armor of the ring had been her main resource. "Mr. Cotter," she said, "I appreciate your visits, but I want to be honest with you because I think that's kinder than the alternative. I'm not in a position to be what you're looking for, and I don't think that's going to change. I hope you find what you need, but I'm not it." Dale Cotter looked at her hand, saw no ring, and then looked at her face, which was serene and sure, and he was a man who recognized a closed door when he was standing in front of one. He took his leave with a dignity that she respected, and he did not come back. November became December, and December brought cold to Dusty Creek that felt different from the cold of Theresa's previous winters there, sharper perhaps, or perhaps she was more alive to it, more aware of the physical world around her. She had conversations with Levi in the evening by the fire in the boarding house sitting room that went late and covered ground she had not covered with anyone in a long time. What she thought about things, what she believed, what she had been afraid of, and what she was less afraid of now. One evening in December, with snow on the ground outside and the lamp burning low and Clyde and Horatio long gone to bed and Rosa conspicuously absent, she and Levi were sitting in the sitting room with the remnants of coffee, and a conversation that had ranged from the economics of the silver industry to the nature of courage, to a particular book that Rosa had lent Theresa, and that Theresa had lent to Levi, and that they had both found remarkable. There was a pause in the conversation that was not uncomfortable. Their silences were never uncomfortable by this point. And then Levi set down his cup and looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was his particular form of courage, the willingness to say the actual thing. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said steadily. "I've been thinking about what it is I want," he said. "Not just work, not just a place to be, what I actually want for my life. And I have an answer that I didn't have 8 months ago." She held very still. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I want a place and I want a person and I want the ordinary things that I've been passing through towns and not quite finding for 8 years. He paused. "I want you, Theresa, if you'll have me, not as a boarder and not as a man passing through, as the person I'm choosing to stay for." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had walked into her life on a roan horse and taken the room at the end of the hall and fixed her roof on a Sunday, and asked about her husband with the only question that mattered. This man who had held her hand in the dark and not asked for more than she could give and had waited with the patience of someone who understood that good things were worth waiting for. "You understand what staying means," she said. "The debts, the boarding house, the town that may or may not survive the mine closing, all of it." "I understand it," he said. "You understand that Jonas was real to me," she said. "That he is real to me, that this isn't replacing him." "I know that," he said gently. "I'm not asking to replace anyone. I'm asking to be next." She felt something settle inside her chest, deep and certain, like the last piece of something large finally finding its place. The word for the feeling was not happiness exactly, not the light, uncomplicated kind. It was something warmer and more durable than that, something that had weight and history in it. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He crossed the space between them and took her hands in his, both of them, and looked at her with an expression she had been carrying in some part of herself since the first time she caught him looking at her across the supper table. He kissed her, carefully and warmly, and with the attention he brought to everything worth attending to, and she kissed him back. And the fire burned low in the grate, and the snow fell silently outside the windows of the boarding house in Dusty Creek, Nevada, and everything was beginning. They were married in March of 1879, in a ceremony at the Dusty Creek Church that was simple and genuine, and attended by everyone in the town who mattered to either of them. Rosa stood beside Theresa in a dress she had made herself, because she was the finest seamstress in the territory, and she was not going to stand next to her friend in anything less than her best work. She had made Theresa's dress too, a deep blue that matched the creekwater color of Theresa's eyes, and Theresa had looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser on the morning of the wedding and thought, with a quiet kind of wonder, that she looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere. Clyde and Horatio had put on their best shirts and combed their hair with an earnestness that was deeply touching, and Percy from the livery stable was there, and the minister spoke simply about the nature of commitment in hard country, and the courage it took to choose another person in a world that made no guarantees. Theresa listened to the words and felt them land truly, without the distance that she had maintained around most truths for the past couple of years. When the minister asked for the ring, Levi produced one that he had made in Carson City on a trip he had taken in February. A silver band because that was what the region produced and what seemed right, set with a small piece of turquoise that was the blue-green color of the sky just after the sun touched the hills. He slid it onto her finger with the care of someone doing something serious, and she felt it settle there like something that belonged. She thought briefly of Jonas's ring in its cedar box on her dresser, and she carried him with her into this new thing, not as a ghost but as a memory that was part of who she was, and that was as it should be. Levi's ring was not armor. It was not a shield. It was just love, made into metal and worn on her hand, and she had earned the right to that distinction. The wedding supper was at the boarding house, which Rosa had spent 2 days transforming from a respectable establishment into something genuinely festive, with ribbon and wildflowers that she had managed to find despite March being not a month known for its wildflowers, and food that Theresa and Rosa had been cooking together since Thursday, and Beaumont and his fiddle provided music, until the evening got late enough that even Clyde and Horatio declared themselves satisfied and went to bed. Rosa, who had had a small amount of the whiskey that appeared from somewhere in the vicinity of the back porch, embraced Theresa in the kitchen at the end of the evening with the particular fierceness of a woman who was genuinely glad for someone else's happiness and said, against her hair, "He is a very good man, and you deserve a very good man, and I am very happy for you." Theresa held her friend and felt the truth of it, the rare and simple pleasure of being seen clearly and approved of by someone whose approval meant something. "What about you?" Theresa said, pulling back to look at Rosa's face. "Are you all right?" Rosa smiled, and it was a real smile with a wry edge to it. "I am always all right," she said, "but ask me again in 6 months. Things have a way of changing." Things did, in fact, have a way of changing. Levi officially joined Theresa in the running of the boarding house, which meant that the practical partnership between them deepened in ways that were sometimes mundane and always real. He contributed his surveying income, which was steady if not large, and took over the maintenance of the property with the competence of a man who had been fixing things in remote places for years. The east side of the roof held through the spring rains with the security of something well repaired. He built a new shelf in the kitchen. He fixed the fence gate that had been sticking since October. Theresa watched him working around the house and felt a contentment so thorough that it sometimes surprised her. Not the frantic happiness of new love, but the deep, durable satisfaction of a life that was properly inhabited, of a house that had become a home in the truest sense. They argued occasionally, because they were real people with real opinions and the kind of confidence that comes from having managed on your own for a long time and not always being sure when to yield. These arguments were mostly short and mostly about practical things. The correct way to deal with a difficult boarder, whether to repair the back stairs immediately or wait until they had more in reserve, how to handle Dale Cotter when he passed them on the main street and gave them the particular look of a man who has accepted a situation but has not quite forgiven it. They argued like people who respected each other, which meant the arguments resolved rather than festered, and they were both willing to be wrong when they were wrong, which made everything considerably easier. The summer of 1879 was good to Dusty Creek in a way that the previous year had not been. A secondary silver seam was found to the northwest of the first, deeper and apparently more extensive, and the mining company brought men back and word got out and new men came, and the town expanded with the particular vigor of a place that has been given a reprieve. 3 new buildings went up on the main street. A second general store opened. A doctor arrived, a young man from San Francisco named Dr. Callum Hayes, who set up a practice and was immediately overwhelmed with the business of a mining town's medical needs. Rosa, whose sewing business had been growing steadily, found herself with more work than she could comfortably manage and hired 2 women to assist her, which improved her financial situation considerably and gave her an establishment rather than just a trade. She had become, by the summer of 1879, a person of consequence in Dusty Creek in a way that she had not been when she arrived as a stranded theatrical seamstress, and she wore this consequence with the same dry, graceful composure she wore everything. It was in August of 1879 that Theresa discovered she was expecting a child. She had not said anything to Levi for the first few weeks because she was not entirely certain, and because she wanted to be sure before she changed anything with the telling of it. When she was sure, she told him on a Sunday evening after supper in the kitchen, with the straightforwardness that characterized her approach to most things. She said, "I'm going to have a baby." He went very still for a moment, the way a man goes still when something large and real has landed in front of him, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that she would keep somewhere inside herself for the rest of her life. "A baby," he said, as if the word was new. "In the spring," she said. "March or April, I think." He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth with a tenderness that was entirely different from anything she would have been able to imagine a year and a half ago, on the morning she had stood at the front step with a broom and watched a man on a roan horse come up the road. "Are you glad?" she asked him because she wanted to hear it from him. "I'm so glad," he said against her hair. "Theresa, I'm so glad." They told Rosa first that same evening, because Rosa was essentially family by that point, and Theresa could no more keep it from her than she could keep it from the sun. Rosa's reaction was to close her eyes briefly with a private expression of profound satisfaction, as if the universe had confirmed something she had been keeping to herself, and then she said, "Good. It's good. And if it's a boy, don't name him anything too grand. Simple names survive better out here." They told Clyde and Horatio at breakfast the next morning, and the 2 old miners responded with the dignified, quiet pleasure of men who had been around long enough to understand what good news actually meant. Horatio shook Levi's hand twice, and then appeared to need to be elsewhere for a moment, which was how he handled anything that threatened to produce visible emotion. The pregnancy was not easy and was not difficult. Theresa was, as she was in most things, straightforwardly determined about it. She kept running the boarding house because it needed running, though she shifted the heavier work to Levi and to a young woman named Elsie who came in 3 times a week to help. She let Dr. Hayes see her monthly, which was his strong recommendation, and which she followed because she was not a fool, and the frontier was not a forgiving environment for complications. The winter of 1879 passed with a slowness that Theresa had not quite anticipated, though perhaps anticipating is too mild a word. Waiting, with the particular weight of waiting for something that will be irreversible, something that will divide your life into before and after. Levi was patient and present and attentive in all the quiet ways that mattered, and she was grateful for him with a depth that sometimes surprised her in the night, waking to hear him breathing beside her in the dark. She took Jonas's ring out of the cedar box one afternoon in January when the light was flat, and the sky outside the window was the color of pewter, and she held it in her palm for a while and thought about the man who had worn its matching band, and who had lied next to her in this same room in a different life. She thought about how he had looked in the morning light, the specific way he had of running his hand through his hair when he was confused, the sound of his laugh. She felt the grief of him, which was not sharp anymore but was still there, honest and real, a real loss that had happened to a real man. She set the ring back in the cedar box and closed it carefully and looked at the silver band on her left hand with the small turquoise stone, and she felt both things at once, the loss and the love, the past and the present, and understood that they were not in opposition. Both were true. Both were hers. The fullness of a life was not the erasure of what came before but the accumulation of all of it, carried forward. Thomas Bell Redmond was born on a Thursday morning in April of 1880, in the bedroom at the back of the boarding house, with Dr. Hayes in attendance and Rosa on the other side of the door, talking very firmly to God about the importance of things going well. He was named Thomas for Levi's father, and Bell for Theresa's family name, which she had never quite been willing to give up even in marriage because it was hers in a way that felt important. He arrived with the particular indignation of newborns, announcing himself with considerable volume, and Theresa held him and looked at his crumpled, furious, completely astounding face, and felt something break open in her that she had not known was still closed. Levi sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and they looked at their son together, this small and impossible person who had arrived and made everything irreversible in the best possible way. "Thomas," Levi said softly, trying the name out as a real thing rather than an idea. Thomas, as if in response to his name, blinked his dark newborn eyes in Levi's direction with an expression of deep suspicion, and Levi laughed, a real, surprised, helpless laugh that Theresa had heard only occasionally and loved every time, and said, "He already looks like he has opinions." "He gets that from somewhere," Theresa said, without specifying where. Rosa came in eventually and held him with the experienced ease of a woman who had considerably more practice with babies than she had ever told anyone about, and she looked at his face and said, in a voice that was slightly thicker than her usual voice, "Hello, Thomas. You have very sensible parents. I suggest you listen to them." Thomas closed his eyes and went to sleep, which was either agreement or dismissal, and everyone in the room felt that it was probably the right response. The months that followed were exhausting in the specific and spectacular way of months that contain a new person. Theresa operated on less sleep than should have been survivable, and did so with the characteristic determination that she brought to all challenges, though she accepted help with a grace that the Theresa of 2 years earlier might not have managed. Elsie took over more of the boarding housework. Rosa appeared at the back door with food at intervals that were too regular to be accidental. Levi got up in the night without being asked and came back to bed smelling of the baby in a way that did something very particular to Theresa's heart. Dusty Creek continued to grow through 1880. The mine produced well. The town acquired a proper school in the fall, which had been needed for years, taught by a young woman from Virginia named Miss Pratt, who was formidably competent and slightly terrifying in the way of the best teachers. The boarding house stayed full, and the combination of Theresa's management and Levi's additional income meant that the debts Jonas had left were, by the end of the year, finally and completely paid off. Theresa sat with the final payment receipt in her hands for a long, quiet moment and felt a weight she had been carrying for 3 years lift off her shoulders and dissolve. "It's done," she said to Levi that evening. He looked at her. "How does it feel?" she considered. "Like putting down something heavy that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it wasn't always there." He reached over and took her hand, the one with the turquoise ring, and held it. "Good," he said simply. In the spring of 1881, Rosa finally told Theresa something that Theresa had been suspecting for several months. She told her, over coffee in the kitchen while Thomas sat on the floor and communed at length with a wooden spoon, that Dr. Callum Hayes had asked her to supper 3 times, and she had said no 3 times, and she was beginning to think she was being foolish. Theresa looked at her. "Are you asking me what I think, or telling me what you've decided?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Both, perhaps. I think," Theresa said carefully, "that you've been managing on your own for a long time, and that's honorable and impressive, but that managing on your own is not the same thing as refusing to want more just in case it doesn't work out." Rosa looked at her coffee. "That is uncomfortably specific." "You told me something similar about 2 years ago," Theresa said. "I believe the exact words were something about being brave instead of wise." Rosa made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I did say that. So say yes to the supper," Theresa said, "or don't, but be honest about why either way." Rosa said yes to the supper. She said yes to the second one too. And by midsummer of 1881, the situation between Rosa Garza and Dr. Callum Hayes had developed into something that the whole town of Dusty Creek had decided opinions about, which Rosa endured with the same composure she brought to all difficulties, and Hayes endured with the distracted good humor of a man too happy to be particularly bothered by anything. Theresa found this development deeply satisfying on every level, which she was not particularly subtle about. "You are enjoying this entirely too much," Rosa told her in August. "I am enjoying it exactly the right amount," Theresa said. The summer of 1881 brought a drought to the region that turned the creek to nothing and the hills to a pale, baked gold, and made the work of the boarding house harder in the way that heat and water scarcity make everything harder. But Dusty Creek had, in its brief history, survived worse, and the town managed with the grim, practical solidarity of a community that had learned that everyone's survival depended on everyone's cooperation. Water was shared, shade was offered, and the small courtesies of the frontier, a hand with a heavy load, a meal shared with someone who was short, a word of encouragement that cost nothing and meant a great deal, were practiced with an openness that Theresa had come to think of as one of the best things about this rough and difficult country. Levi's reputation as a surveyor had grown in the region, and he had been offered a contract by a larger land company that would have taken him back to California, to the Sacramento work that had been available when he first arrived in Dusty Creek. He declined it, which the company found difficult to understand but which Levi found very easy, and negotiated instead a continuing arrangement that kept his work in the Nevada and Northern California border region, close enough to come home, because it was home now. That was the word, the right one, the one that covered everything. The boarding house and the town and the brown hills and the boarding house table where the evening meal was a specific kind of pleasure, and the bedroom where Thomas slept in the crib Levi had built from wood sourced from a sawmill in Carson City, and the back porch where on Sunday afternoons Theresa sometimes still sat with her mending, and the sun was warm, and the coffee was good, and Levi was reading somewhere nearby. And all of it together was home in the fullest, most earned sense of the word. Thomas turned 2 in April of 1882 with the vigorous determination of a child who had decided that being 2 years old was the most important business currently underway in the world. He had Theresa's gray-green eyes and Levi's dark curly hair, and an opinion about everything, usually delivered at volume, and both of his parents loved him so completely that it sometimes took their breath away. He followed Levi around the house with the particular devotion of a small boy for his father, reaching for his hand on the back steps, bringing him things, a stone, a button, a piece of wood, as gifts that Levi received with the same grave, attentive courtesy he brought to everything. Rosa married Callum Hayes on a Saturday in June of 1882, in a ceremony at the same church where Theresa and Levi had married, and Theresa stood beside her as she had stood beside Theresa, and thought about the Thursday afternoon 2 years ago when Rosa had come through the door of the boarding house with her sewing box and her pragmatic determination, and felt the warm, round satisfaction of a story that had found its way to something good. At the wedding reception, which was held in the yard of the Hayes house because Callum had a larger yard than the boarding house and the weather was fine, Levi found Theresa standing by herself for a moment near the fence, watching Thomas try to catch a butterfly with the absolute seriousness of a small boy who has decided that catching this particular butterfly is the project of his life. Levi stood beside her and watched too. "Happy," he said after a while. She looked at him. The afternoon light was the particular gold of June in Nevada, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been kept somewhere safe and brought out for important occasions. His face was familiar and dear and still interesting to her in the way that faces are interesting when the person wearing them continues to surprise you and delight you and teach you things. "Yes," she said. "Very." He took her hand, the left one with the silver and turquoise ring, and held it, and they watched their son chase the butterfly through the long gold afternoon, and the world was wide and good around them. In the autumn of 1882, Thomas began to talk in connected sentences that made a kind of demanding, vivid sense, and one of the first sentences he produced that had real content to it was addressed to the cedar box on his mother's dresser, which he had been eyeing for some time as an interesting object. He pointed at it and said, with the imperious clarity of a 2-year-old who has decided something is worth knowing, "What's in there?" Theresa sat down beside him on the floor of the bedroom and opened the box, and Thomas looked inside with the complete, unguarded curiosity of a small person for whom everything in the world is still potentially magical. He saw the watch which he reached for immediately and which she let him hold carefully. He saw the photographs which he considered with the solemn attention of a child who understands that old photographs are serious things, and he saw the gold ring and he pointed at it. "Ring," he said. "Yes," Theresa said. "That ring belonged to a man named Jonas. He was a good man. He was married to me before your papa." Thomas considered this with the earnest, processing frown of a child encountering a new category of information. Then he looked up at her and said, "Papa is better." Theresa felt something in her chest that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but something in the warm, complicated territory between them. "Papa is very good," she agreed. She closed the cedar box carefully and put it back on the dresser, and Thomas went back to the wooden spoon that was his current most valued possession, and Theresa sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the fullness of life, and how it contained loss and love simultaneously, and did not require you to choose between them, and how the bravest thing she had ever done was not running a boarding house alone in a silver mining town or managing debts and difficult men with a gold ring as armor. But the Sunday afternoon on the back porch, when a man with steady brown eyes had asked about her husband quietly, and she had taken the ring off, that was the beginning of everything that mattered. It was as simple and as complicated as that. In March of 1883, 5 years after Levi Redmond had ridden into Dusty Creek on a roan horse, Theresa discovered she was expecting another child. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, straightforwardly, in the kitchen in the morning, and he responded the same way too, going still, and then coming to her with his hands on her face and his eyes full of everything he had always had trouble saying in more words. Their daughter, Emma Rose Redmond, was born in October of 1883, in the same bedroom and with the same doctor and with Rosa on the other side of the same door. Older now and more certain of the universe's intentions, but no less fervent in her communications with it. She was a quiet baby in the beginning, watchful with Thomas's dark hair and Theresa's gray-green eyes, and she regarded the world from the beginning with the kind of calm, appraising attention that made Rosa say, the first time she held her, "This one is going to be formidable." "They're both formidable," Levi said, in the slightly dazed voice of a man who has just watched his family grow again. "Yes," Rosa said with great satisfaction, "they get it from their mother." Theresa, who was tired in the deep and good way of a woman who has just done something enormous, held her daughter and looked around the room at the people in it, Levi beside her, Rosa with her, Callum Hayes standing in the doorway being professionally calm and privately moved, and Thomas at the edge of things, peering around Rosa's skirts with enormous eyes, and felt the full weight of her life, all of it. From the grief of Jonas's death to the first morning, she had swept the front step of the boarding house to the Sunday afternoon on the back porch to this room, this moment, this extraordinary, ordinary fullness. She looked at Levi, who was looking at her with the expression she had kept inside herself since the first time she caught it, and she thought, this is what brave gets you. This is the thing on the other side of the ring and the armor and the careful management of a heart that has been hurt. This is what comes after the asking and the answering. This is it. The years were good ones. Dusty Creek grew and then settled into a sustainable size. Not the boomtown rush that some silver towns achieved and then lost catastrophically, but a steady, working town existence that suited it. The mine kept producing at a moderate rate that was less exciting than the peaks and more durable than the busts, and the town built itself around the practical needs of real life. The school expanded, and then a second school opened on the east side. A proper dry goods emporium replaced the original general store. The church acquired a bell. Levi's survey work continued to be the kind that kept him in the region, and he had by the mid-1880s built a reputation that brought work to him, rather than requiring him to go find it, which suited their life considerably. He was known in the territory as a man whose surveys could be relied on precise, honest, arrived at by proper process, and in a world where land disputes were frequent and often violent, this reputation had real value. Theresa had taken in fewer boarders as the years went on, not because the business was not good, but because the needs of the house and the family had shifted, and she had reorganized things accordingly. She kept 2 rooms for boarders and used the third as a proper family room, which was a luxury she had not allowed herself in the early years, and which she now accepted as appropriate. The boarding house income supplemented what they needed, and what they needed was, if not easy, consistently manageable. Thomas grew in the way of boys who have been well-rooted, steadily, and with increasing competence. By the time he was 5, he was following Levi out to the small survey work Levi sometimes did locally, carrying the smaller instruments with the seriousness of a child apprentice, asking constant questions about why the measurements mattered and how they worked. Levi answered every question with the same care he brought to everything, and watching the 2 of them bent over a map together at the kitchen table in the evenings, Theresa sometimes thought that she would not exchange this particular sight for any other in the world. Emma proved Rosa right. She was formidable by age 3 and showed no signs of modifying this characteristic as she grew older. She was also deeply sweet in the way of children who are confident of their welcome in the world, confident enough not to need to be hard all the time, and her combination of determination and warmth reminded Theresa, sometimes, of herself at her best. Rosa and Callum Hayes had a child of their own in 1884, a boy named Louis after Rosa's father, who was Thomas's immediate and devoted companion in the way of children the same age who live close to each other. The Hayes household and the Redmond household were so thoroughly intertwined by 1885 that Sunday suppers rotated between the 2, and Christmas was always together, and the children moved between the two houses with the ease of children who understand that family is sometimes larger than blood. In the spring of 1886, Theresa turned 34 years old. Levi was 39. They had been married 7 years, and the 7 years had done what 7 real years do: deepened things and tested things, and revealed things about both of them that had not been visible in the early gentleness of the beginning. He had a temper that came out rarely but came out real, when injustice was involved, when he saw someone being treated with contempt they did not deserve. She had seen it twice, in disputes that he had entered on behalf of people with less standing than their opponents, and she loved this about him with a particular fierceness, because it was the anger of a man who had a clear sense of right and acted on it. She had a stubbornness that could calcify into inflexibility if she was not careful, and Levi had learned over the years how to come at her sideways when she had fixed herself in a position, gently proposing a different angle rather than confronting the position head-on, and this had prevented several arguments from becoming more than they needed to be, and had occasionally resulted in her arriving at the right conclusion in a way that felt like it was entirely her own idea. They were, in short, married in the real way, with all the grain and texture that real life puts into things, and the love between them was not the same thing it had been at the beginning, not softer but not harder, more whole, more complex, more in possession of its own history. It was on an afternoon in October of 1886 that Theresa was in the bedroom, and she opened the cedar box for the first time in a long while. Thomas was at school. Emma was in the backyard with Levi, who was repairing the fence on the west side, and whose running commentary to Emma on the process of fence repair was audible through the open window in the particular way of a man who has been talking to small children long enough to make instruction automatically conversational. She opened the box and took out Jonas's ring. It was unchanged, as things in cedar boxes are unchanged. Just a gold band, worn smooth, simple. She turned it in her fingers and thought about Theresa Bell, who had been 29 years old when she married him and 31 years old when he died, and who had been, as she had once told Levi, a decent man who did not deserve a fever. She thought about what their life had been: small and practical and genuinely affectionate, nothing grand but honest. She thought about what her life had become, and she felt the warmth of it deep and sure, and she thought, he would have been glad for me. Jonas, who had been a decent man, would have wanted this for her. She believed that without needing anyone to confirm it. She set the ring back in the box and closed it. Through the window she heard Emma say, "Papa, when is it fixed?" And Levi say, "When it stops wiggling," and Emma say with enormous patience, "But when is that?" and Levi say, "Soon," and then laugh in the way he laughed, surprised and helpless and entirely genuine. She went downstairs and through the kitchen and out into the October afternoon, where the air was cool and the sky was that deep Nevada blue that had no equivalent, and Levi was crouched by the fence post in his work clothes, and Emma was sitting on an upturned bucket nearby supervising the operation with the gravity it deserved. Emma saw her and said, "Mama, the fence is not fixed yet." "I can see that," Theresa said, walking to where they were. She stood beside Levi, and he looked up at her with those brown eyes that still paid attention to things in the way she had noticed on the first day, and she felt the whole of their life together in that look: the boarding house and the back porch and the Sunday walks and the ring coming off and the ring going on and Thomas and Emma and every supper table and every argument and every quiet evening and every morning and all of it. "Almost done," he said. "Take your time," she said. She sat down on the ground beside the fence, in the October afternoon, and Emma climbed into her lap, and Levi went back to the fence post with the steady competence of a man who knew what he was doing and was glad to be doing it. And the western sky was going pink at the edges, where the sun was beginning to think about setting, and Dusty Creek was going about its ordinary business beyond the fence, and everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. Theresa rested her chin on Emma's dark hair and looked at the sky and at her husband's hands working at the fence post and at the ordinary, extraordinary afternoon, and she was grateful for all of it, for the whole long way from the boarding house step with the broom to this, from the gold ring worn as armor to the silver ring worn as love. From the woman who had put her dead husband's ring on every morning to keep the world at a manageable distance to the woman sitting in the dirt of her own yard with her daughter in her lap and her husband at arm's length, and nothing to keep away at all. She was exactly where she had been going all along. It had just taken a man with steady brown eyes and a quiet question to show her the way there. The fence post stopped wiggling. Levi leaned back on his heels and looked at it with the satisfaction of a job completed, and Emma said, "It is fixed now, Papa." And he said, "It is fixed now, Emma." And he turned and looked at Theresa with the small, private smile that was hers specifically. And she smiled back, and the sun went down behind the hills in the wide Nevada sky, and the evening came on in that good and ordinary way. And the story of Theresa Bell was not over, was in fact fuller and more alive than it had ever been, built on loss and courage and a Sunday afternoon and a question asked quietly, and a ring taken off and a whole life given back.